And now I would like to introduce today's special guests. Why Afghanistan? Surely this is a question for the ages. Down through the millennia, soldiers of many armies have likely wondered, why Afghanistan? The list of great powers who have tried to subdue this landlocked knot of mountains is a long one. Many have tried, none have really succeeded. From the ancient Persians to Alexander the Great, from the Mongol hordes to the British Army, and on to the Soviets, all learned the same lesson. Taking Afghanistan is hard. Holding it is even harder. Today, a multinational alliance of over 60 nations is committed to holding, defending, and rebuilding Afghanistan. And the use of thousands of alliance troops in order to attain this goal can readily be justified. We know that this country, in a constant state of war for almost 3 decades, needs stability in order to rebuild. We know that the Afghani people have suffered enough. As part of the UN-mandated NATO alliance, Canada's mission in Afghanistan is to help create the conditions for peace. Part of this effort has meant meeting a ruthless enemy in battle. Prime Minister Stephen Harper says Canada is committed to success in Afghanistan, despite Taliban threats of a bloody spring that may cost the lives of yet more Canadians. But with the death of every one of our soldiers, Canadians are increasingly wondering whether the cause is worth the cost. They wonder if the burden of beating back the Taliban is being equally shared by all member nations of the NATO alliance. Do the people of Afghanistan themselves support the presence of the world's armed forces on their soil, or the US-backed government of President Hamid Karzai? In order to help us understand this complex and vital subject, please allow me to introduce our honored guests. Christopher Alexander is the United Nations Deputy Special Representative of the Secretary General for Afghanistan, appointed by Secretary General Kofi Annan. Mr. Alexander is responsible for political issues, as well as issues related to peace and stability, security sector reform, and human rights. He previously served as Canadian ambassador to Afghanistan. NATO spokesman James Appathurai served as a policy officer with the Department of National Defense before joining the policy planning and speechwriting section at NATO. As spokesman, he clarifies NATO's position on its many duties in Europe and beyond. Ladies and gentlemen, as I turn things over to our very capable moderator, Dr. Janice Stein, please join me in welcoming these 2 men, experts on Afghanistan, to explain the UN and NATO positions on international involvement there and help us answer that important question, why Afghanistan? Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Noella. And let me start by asking both James and Chris how each of you would define success as we move along and how you would know if you were succeeding. Why don't we start with James?
Thank you. And thank you all for coming. This is a critical question because I think Canadians and, frankly, the publics in all of the 37 countries contributing troops to NATO operations want to know, is it winnable and are we winning? That's a critical question. And what is the end state? Clearly, the end state is not Switzerland. We are not trying to help the Afghans build a mirror image of a Western European state. So the first point I would make is, in the metaphysical sense, the Afghans have set a priority for themselves, and we are trying to help them do it, and that is to create a state that is at peace with itself, that is pluralistic, that protects fundamental human rights, and that is no longer a threat also to its region and to the international community. From a NATO point of view, of course, we have a more limited mandate. We are trying to help create the conditions for that and help create the conditions for the UN to do its very important work across the civilian spectrum. A critical element of that for us will be when the Afghan National Security Forces are able to fight their own fight, defend their own country, and we are helping to train and develop them so that we can, over time, step back and let them take a greater share of the burden, and that will be an element of building the success that the Afghan people want.
Chris?
Definitely an Afghanistan that is at peace with itself and its neighbors. That is the key overriding objective. That's the rationale for the initial military intervention. But we know that to create peace, to anchor peace, there also has to be nation building, and there have to be institutions that meet the hopes and aspirations of Afghanistan. So I would add to the very correct answer James has given the question of government institutions that are legitimate and credible at the center, in the provinces, and that have shown an ability to sustain themselves, not just by generating tax revenue, but being able to hold elections not once, but repeatedly. And for that reason, the next electoral cycle, 2008, 2009, will be extremely important. And the final key ingredient, the final objective, is for Afghanistan to be on a development path. Again, not to be vaulted into the ranks of the OECD countries. That won't happen. But to be on a path upwards from extreme poverty to lesser forms of poverty and to integration with the global economy. And that development path needs to be anchored internally in the creation of wealth inside Afghanistan and not in aid dependence on assistance from generous countries like Canada.
Chris, let me follow up with a question from a member of the audience. They're asking about Pakistan, Pakistan's role in contributing to the insurgency in southern Afghanistan, and do you see any viable UN and or NATO and or diplomatic strategy that could attempt to deal with that problem, if indeed it is a problem?
The consensus view in Kabul, and I think in the world today, is that security is not just the security challenge, particularly acute in southern Afghanistan, is not an Afghan challenge alone. It is a regional challenge. And here, Pakistan is one of the principal partners, but there are other players that have important work to do in the region and around the world. Pakistan is certainly espousing a policy of supporting peace and security in Afghanistan. That is what they say, and much of the time, that is what their army and their institutions do when they cooperate with ISAF in cross-border consultations about military operations, when they hold really intense consultations with the Afghan National Army about security issues. But then there are other groups inside Pakistan who are demonstrably not sharing that agenda, not committed to that agenda. And we need to strengthen those in Pakistan who are, empower those in Pakistan who are in a position to influence those groups and to make sure that they are not interfering in Afghanistan or supporting the Taliban leadership and other jihadist groups that are interfering. And here, there really isn't room for debate. Everyone wants this to be done. There's been much more frank discussion of it over the past couple of months, and we need quite simply to get specific about what needs to be done in Pakistan and to build up the level of cooperation between the two countries.
James, on a related subject, I know this is a question that many in the room would want to ask you. There is a feeling that Canada has been bearing a heavy share of the burden in the south, in Kandahar province, and we see other NATO allies that have so-called caveated their forces, which means put restrictions on where their forces can go. And when some of the fighting has gotten difficult, those forces are unable to come to the assistance of Canadian forces. How do you see the role of NATO evolving to deal with these differences among NATO members?
These are very important questions, and I can tell you it's not just Canada that has been sensitive to this. A lot of the countries that have troops in the south have raised concerns about force levels and about what you call caveats quite correctly, and that's restrictions on troops moving from one zone to another to support their colleagues. We have had very frank discussions. I can tell you the Canadian government has been extremely clear behind closed doors at NATO about their views. The yardsticks have moved very, very far. We have added 7,000 troops to the NATO mission in the last 3 months. The majority of those are devoted to the south. In the last 18 months, we've gone from 1,000 troops in the south of Afghanistan to 12,500. It is a significant increase. Second point, at the Riga summit, a NATO summit that we had 3 months ago, all 26 heads of state and government committed that in an emergency situation, their troops could go anywhere in the country to support others. That is a critical demonstration of solidarity. We have seen it demonstrated not least 4 weeks ago when French Mirage aircraft came out of the zone into the south in direct close air support of Canadian troops that were in trouble. So we have, I think, moved very far. General Hillier and Minister O'Connor have said recently that they are now satisfied with troop levels and on the caveat issue, considering how fiercely they fought, as I said, to move the yardsticks. I think that's a testimony that we can take and bank it.
Let me ask a question to Chris that I know Sally would ask, Sally Armstrong. A report came out just this week, a very interesting one called Breaking Point, which was published in Washington, which is actually a very rigorous evaluation of benchmark progress in Afghanistan. And one area that stood the test, one of only two, was changes in the lives of women and the opportunities that women have in Afghanistan, which is often, I feel, an issue that doesn't get enough public attention. Do you see that, Chris? Do you see measurable progress? And can you tell us a little bit about the differences in the South as opposed to the North and the West part of the country?
Very important question. We do see progress, but we're not comfortable, never comfortable that it is enough because, quite frankly, we as Canadians, we as an international community want to see more, and Afghanistan, as in so many areas, is starting from a very low base of empowerment of women, of literacy for women, of education for women. And those indicators are not going to improve overnight. But with 5.4 million children in school, 34% of whom are girls, we are seeing a historical record achieved in Afghanistan for exposure of girl children to education. Literacy programs are extremely strong. The representation of women in parliament and in national institutions has never been stronger. There's only one woman governor of the province of Bamyan, but 26% of the lower house of parliament is composed of women. I think a higher number than we have here in Canada. Correct me if I'm wrong.
That's correct.
And certainly in many donor countries who are otherwise proud of their record of empowerment of women. And this isn't an idle fact. These women are vocal. They are more committed to the reform agenda, to the objectives of the Afghanistan Compact, the framework in which we're all working now, quite frankly, than the men. And you can rely on the women not to have been commanders, not to have committed human rights abuses during 30 years of war. So it's a tremendously strong card to play, but one needs to do more. Fortunately, the support is generous from Canada and other countries, and the implementation mechanisms for improving a lot of women, and particularly economic empowerment of women, are there. Of maybe 6 or 7 ministries out of 25 in Afghanistan that are viable, that can deliver a program in which we would have confidence investing $20 million for a given objective. The Ministry of Women's Affairs is one of those viable institutions.
James, you want to add?
Just to add a small point, the kinds of projects into which the Canadian government has just announced $200 million, things like microfinance are certainly demonstrably of benefit, in particular to women. So I think the recent donation by the Canadian government is something that we should tip our hat to because it will have benefits for that community as well.
Let me ask James a question. There is a lot of discussion on soft Taliban, hard Taliban, new old Taliban, and strategies, in fact, for separating off soft supporters of the Taliban in the South from the hardcore. What's NATO's strategy toward the Taliban? Do you make these distinctions? Do you think they're valid? And is, in fact, there a strategic direction there?
These are valid distinctions. I think it is very important to understand that there is a hard core of fighters who will not be co-opted, who will not be convinced, and whose mission is to overthrow the government, and they will commit the most outrageous human rights abuses as they go for that goal. These people cannot be talked to, so they have to be compartmentalized. But there is a big pool of poorly paid or unpaid young men who are being given $10 a day to pick up a gun and go and fight. And that's more than the Afghan National Army is getting to go and fight. So it's a big pool. What we don't want to do at NATO is have an indiscriminate approach to this big group. We want to separate out and deal with the hardcore, and to the extent possible not have to engage militarily with these young men who are militarily untrained. That is not the approach we want to take. So I can tell you, without going obviously into operational details, that NATO's military commanders are very focused on this. They do indeed want to separate out the hardcore and deal with them from the others, and hopefully not have to deal with them in a very robust and military way.
Go ahead.
Let me say something on the military detail. The strategy of going after Taliban leaders, particularly in the last 3 or 4 months, has started to work. In December of 2006, in a largely British-led operation, the number 3 commander of the Taliban, who's on the UN list, who is demonstrably an ideological leader, Mullah Akhtar Osmani, was killed in Helmand. And this threw the Taliban in Helmand province, which is their probably number 1 current base of operations inside Afghanistan, into disarray. Similarly, over the past 2 or 3 months, other senior commanders have been killed in Helmand, and that is delaying the ability of the Taliban to mount the operations they would like to mount in that province. So the hardcore is at the center of the problem. The leadership structures are at the center of the problem, and they must face justice at the very least, and if they come onto the battlefield, they're going to face military force. But as James says, there are larger components of the movement or of the war economy around the Taliban that can be brought into sympathy with the government, that can be negotiated with, and everyone agrees that that has to be a major focus in 2007.
Let me ask a very Canadian question. I've got 3 versions of this question, so it is a very Canadian question in case the 2 of you miss home every now and then. The question is, in fact, our army is so heavily engaged now in Afghanistan. Effectively, we can't go anywhere else. Our our development assistance program is now at $1.2 billion over the last decade. Do you think that this focus, this priority to Afghanistan, which is curtailing our capacity in this country to do other things, is justified? Is Afghanistan that important? And here's the really Canadian question, does it compromise our capacity to be peacekeepers elsewhere in the world?
Well, we are Canadians, but neither of us are Canadian government spokesmen, so I think you can take this as a personal view. I can think of no mission that is more in the Canadian tradition of peacekeeping than this one. This is a mission that NATO is carrying out on the direction of the United Nations under UN Security Council mandate to preserve fundamental human rights and to defend against terrorism. We are helping the Afghans build a pluralistic democracy. That is what they are building, and we're doing it. I can see no break in the tradition of what we have always done. Is it important? Yes. Afghanistan was the grand central station of terrorism, with extremist groups from at least 24 countries coming in, training in terrorist camps, and leaving to launch attacks in Europe, in Africa, in North America, and they killed hundreds and then thousands of people. This is a fact, and this is 5 years ago in a historical sense. It's today, it's yesterday. So we have every reason to focus on this and to do it right, because if we don't do it right, those same people are still there, and they want to do the same thing. And that's not hyperbole, that's fact.
Couldn't agree more. One has to set priorities in foreign policy, especially when the job is complex, when the job is multi-year, when it's nation building, which has so many dimensions, each of which consumes enormous costs. Afghanistan is not just our Canadian priority. Canada has shown leadership, but it is a priority for the international community and the organizations we hold dear. And I think Canadians are comfortable with the idea that they can't do everything at once. And that if we succeed in Afghanistan, we will set ourselves up for success in other places. Quite frankly, our troops are not wanted now. We know in the United Nations, because we've led these very difficult negotiations in Darfur, in Sudan. That is going to remain an African Union mission for some time to come. But if we have success in Afghanistan, if the mission crests, perhaps we'll be more ready to tackle that mission and others down the road. We also have to keep in mind that it's in Canada's best traditions not only of peacekeeping, but of establishing the peace. Operation Medusa, which took place in September and arguably saved a very bad situation in Afghanistan. It was the first brigade-level combat operation ever undertaken in NATO history. Canadian troops were at the heart of it, and it was a combat operation. And it's not every nation's troops that can succeed in those difficult circumstances. As Colonel Pat Stoger knows, we have, because he led them, the first ones to go to Kandahar, as General Maurice Paris knows, the Canadians have special capabilities. And if we denied those, if we chose to hold them in reserve against some kind of abstract scenario, possibility that they might be needed elsewhere, I don't think we would be living up to our own expectations of ourselves.
So let me ask James and Chris a question with a one-line answer from each of you. How long should our forces stay?
No end date, end state. We have to figure out, we have to create the conditions for us to leave. But setting short-term timelines feeds the insecurity of Afghans who are afraid that they will be abandoned again. So it is a critical area, and you will not see a NATO official give an end date.
Chris?
We should stay until we know where Mullah Omar is, and we can be pretty certain that he's not leading an armed insurgency in Afghanistan. We should stay until the senior leadership of the Taliban is no longer poses a military threat to Afghanistan. And Jalaluddin Haqqani and Gulbuddin Hekmatyar are the other key leaders of the insurgency who've made themselves subordinates of Al-Qaeda, of Osama bin Laden for this cause, are no longer a danger. And that is a regional challenge, yes. Our troops are not the only players, but they're an important component of a very complex effort that is actually gaining speed and traction today.
Slight shift of emphasis here. The latest data show that, in fact, the opium crop accounts for more than a third of what we call the illicit GDP of Afghanistan, even though Afghanistan has had an extraordinary growth rate since 2002. There's huge controversy about appropriate strategies for dealing with the drug trade. And that affects both of you, I think. Why don't we start with James and then go to Chris?
I don't think there is actually real controversy, though I know that some issues have been raised about legalizing the crop. Very simply, the Afghan government, President Karzai, are very clear. They want this economy eradicated. President Karzai believes it's un-Islamic and he wants it done. So it's their country, and that's the first priority. Second point, yes, it's a problem, but it's doable. Pakistan in the 1980s was the world's biggest producer of poppy, produced 70%, 900 tons a year. 900 tons in the 1970s and 80s per year. By 1997, that was down to 24 tons, and by 1999, it was down to 2. And that's right next door. So this can be done with a coordinated strategy, not just eradication, but building all of the necessary elements of a proper counter-narcotics effort. That's exactly what Chris Alexander is helping to lead.
Chris?
The challenge is implementation. As James says, the strategy is a good one. The strategy is actually working in those parts of the country, most of the country, where we have decent governance, the rule of law, civil administration that is honest, and burgeoning rural development. A rural milieu where farmers have options to replant their pomegranate orchards, to make some money by growing a surplus of grain, by selling orange blossoms to the fragrance industry in Paris. These sorts of things are happening in 2/3 of Afghanistan. Where it's not happening is in the insurgency-affected south, where, quite frankly, rural development actors can't get into the field. And it's not an answer just to do eradication without doing these other things. We must provide security, above all in Helmand, Kandahar, and Uruzgan provinces, where the industry is now concentrated, and where the Taliban is intimately involved. And the Taliban should carry a lot of the blame for this.
Let me ask one very pointed question. I know there are serious discussions with the United States in the lead here about aerial spraying. And I know also that is the source of some of the controversy. Is that James's?
Well,
Chris kicked that one over.
There have been, as you correctly indicated, some very pointed, tense discussions about this issue. Aerial spraying has been, and ground-based spraying has been tried in other areas. The United States, with some support from the United Kingdom was committed to pilot projects this year, but the Afghan government's position was equally clear. 10 or 12 government agencies, health, rural development, agriculture, defense, they all said no. This is not the right strategy for Afghanistan today, especially in Helmand province, where 60% of the crop comes from, where the Taliban is strong, and where destroying the livelihoods of farmers who are already intimidated by the Taliban, vulnerable to the Taliban, is really not a good strategy.
Let me ask a follow-on question. If you were designing the next stage of the development assistance program, and for you expatriates who aren't home, development assistance is a hot subject of controversy in this country right now. So if you were designing the next stage development assistance program for Afghanistan, Chris, what would be your top 2 or 3 priorities, given that our forces are in the south? So wear your Canadian hat.
It's a very exciting topic because there is already a framework for development in Afghanistan that is almost unparalleled. This Afghanistan Compact, agreed at London, January 2006, by 70 players around the table, is a long-term framework for development. And now an Afghanistan National Development Strategy, funded partly by Canada, is being fleshed out to say specifically what ought to be done sector by sector and province by province. What are the top priorities? They're really the areas we haven't addressed sufficiently until now. One would be probably funding a much larger scale strategy for women. One would be funding much more robust agricultural development across the whole country. And then a third priority must be civil administration at provincial level, including the rule of law. Institutions of courts and prosecutors at provincial level who are, quite frankly, now not funded or equipped to be any other than quite corrupt.
So that gives me an opening to ask Barbara McDougall's question. What about the issue of corruption, which we read a great deal about, both at the national level, but more seriously, I think, with respect to the Afghan National Police at the local level, and particularly in the south?
Well, corruption is a huge handicap to the development process in many countries, especially post-conflict countries, and Afghanistan is no exception. Fortunately, the issue has profile. The Chief Justice is in charge of a commission that is meeting regularly to address the issue. The Attorney General, who is now a true reformer, confirmed by the Parliament last year, is investigating people left and right across the country, high and low. And we hope those investigations will lead to trials and convictions of people for corruption. But it's a long way to go. The 2 ministries that were most vulnerable because they had the biggest budgetary resources were education and interior. Fortunately, education now has, as minister, the star of the Afghan cabinet, Hanif Atmar, who led the Rural Rehabilitation and Development Ministry and made it the fantastic force for good that it is today. The Ministry of Interior is everyone's central priority for reform, with a lot of U.S. funding, a lot of German funding, and a lot of attention from the UN. And as I was saying over lunch, every police leader now, from the colonel level up to the highest ranks, has been appointed on the basis of a merit-based competition now, for the first time probably in Afghan history. And that is helping to set an example in the Ministry of Interior that is much more based on probity and integrity, and where corruption is less effective. But it's not over. Police officers at lower ranks are trading drugs, trafficking drugs, are abusing their communities, are setting up illegal checkpoints, and Afghans complain about this. So we need to continue the drive towards progress.
I don't know about the rest of you, but I could keep going for another hour or 2. Unfortunately, we can't, and so I'm going to ask Mr. Ivan Alexander to come, and to come, who is the director of the Canadian Club, to come forward and thank our 2 speakers. As he's making his way to the podium, I can't help making a personal remark. I taught James, and I've known Chris, and I'm just so proud of both of them.
Well, let me thank you for what you taught me. I have felt a little infantilized up here because I have my old teacher and my old classmate and my mother all sitting here. But let me, if this is the moment, also thank everyone who organized this and everybody who came, the Canadian Club, the PPC. Chris and I both thank you very, very much for coming. It's very impressive that so many of you in this town, not in Ottawa, are interested in this issue and engaged at such a high level. We have so many high-level people here.
And if I can simply amplify those thanks, in this room, the attention and interest speaks for itself. It's tangible. But across Canada, the amount of attention for Afghanistan is really gratifying, not for us, but for Afghans, because this project will not succeed without debate. And being in a room with all of you, including my parents, and and uncle and cousins and so forth, but also including people who've worked on Afghanistan and dedicated professional attention to Afghanistan of a very high quality. And I'm thinking here of Her Excellency Adrian Clarkson, who visited troops not once but twice for New Year's and helped to show that this was not just the Canadian forces, this was a national project. This was a projet de société for Canada. Sally Armstrong, who's written about Afghanistan as a fierce champion of Afghan women, and many others. It's a real pleasure to have been with all of you and to continue the dialogue. And we are, we feel the benefits of the support that your interest represents.
Your Excellency, Madam President, Minister, ladies and gentlemen here and in the far-flung audience, I'm delighted to extend the thanks of the Canadian Club of Toronto to our dynamic speakers and teachers, Chris Alexander, my new cousin, and James, first cousin, yes, and James Appathurai, and our moderator, Dr. Janice Stein. Now, ladies and gentlemen, you'll recall the Roman poet who said, if we want peace, we must prepare for war. You'll also remember the late Mike Pearson, whose foresight and leadership made Canadians a great nation with an illustrious record of peacekeeping and peacemongering. Today we have been taken a step further in fashioning some optimum answers to the question, why Afghanistan? Our two speakers have given us informed insights into the workings of the situation on the ground. They preface that with a well-reasoned understanding of the geopolitical and military imperatives. And I want to thank them variously for a number of things. Thanks for pointing out that Afghanistan is the Afghans' country. Thanks for pointing out that our mission in Afghanistan is a Canadian priority and that it is in the great tradition of Canadian peacekeeping and that we must stay the course. Thanks for not pulling punches about timelines and the question of corruption, about the cost to Canada and other countries, and about our contribution that we have been making. At another level, thank you for pointing out some success benchmarks, helping us the Afghanistans to create a stable society of peace with itself and with its neighbors. I can remember being told, if there's a problem, well, it's too far away. That was using the Afghanistan approach. Put it out of your mind, it won't bother us. But of course, it's right here on our doorsteps. Thank you, gentlemen, for helping us see the light beyond the tunnel, beyond the morass. When you mentioned the prospects for greater literacy, greater human capital development, especially with regard to women. And finally, as a measure of our thanks, I want to assure you on behalf of the Canadian Club that we Canadians will never shirk our international expectations and obligations. Thank you again.